In our other video, we talked about hair embryology, hair anatomy, and hair cycling. Today we're going to talk more specifically about the characteristics of a hair shaft. What things I'm looking for in terms of characteristics important for your hair transplant, as well as what characteristics predispose it toward hair fracture or weathering or problems that could come up on a day-to-day wear and tear of a hair shaft. So let's focus on, first of all, the characteristics that I'm looking for when I'm deciding on you as a candidate for hair transplant. There are the three C's. The first is caliber, the second is color or color contrast, and the third is curl. Caliber is the most important of the three. Cole, in a study, found that a change in actually just 1/100th of a millimeter could lead to a 36% increase in visual density for a result. That's pretty important. So caliber is very, very important. In fact, one of the measurements of looking at donor density is actually what's called a hair mass index, which accounts for the hair density, the hair caliber. Because oftentimes when we look at the donor density, we're just looking at how closely spaced the follicles are. But if the follicles are very thin and there's a lot of density, it may not be the same effect as someone with moderate density and very, very thick, coarse hair. At the same time, when we're looking at someone with very, very coarse hair, for example, an Asian, you have to be very, very cognizant of making sure that that result looks natural. And the way that we do that is very low angled grafts, very tiny grafts toward the front, and there's less of a tolerance in terms of a result when you're dealing with a very thick, straight caliber hair. So caliber is probably the most important attribute when we're looking at for hair transplant. The second is color contrast. So it's color of the hair shaft as well as the contrast to the scalp. So there's two elements to this. The darker the hair, the more visual density there's going to be. But at the same time, as I said, if there's a lot of color to the hair and there's less color to the scalp, there's more of a contrast. So that thick caliber, thick shaft, for example, in an Asian hair, has to be handled correctly and placed correctly to get a great result. And the color contrast, if there's very little color contrast as well between the scalp, say you have a darker color scalp and a dark hair, it's going to lead to more visual density. Same thing if you have a lighter color hair and a lighter color scalp, it's going to be better than a dark hair with a light scalp in terms of color contrast. And those are some of the thoughts when I'm deciding on the size of grafts, the distribution of grafts for hair transplantation. The final element is the curl, and the curl can be subdivided into curls, waves, and frizziness. The curl itself is something that relates to something, for example, that would be more predominant in an African American hair, which is a spiraling effect. That actually leads to quite a bit of visual density when you're looking at it, because it's actually creating a lot of surface area, and you can't see the point of insertion for the graft. So that also not only increases visual density, but increases naturalness of the result, especially in unskilled hands. The second component is wave, which is similar to curl, but it basically refers to this undulation of it. And the more wave there is, the more natural the result could be potentially if, again, more unskilled hands, but we take that into account in terms of deciding graft sizes, as well as more visual density. The final component is frizziness. The frizziness relates more to the texture of the hair. We're going to talk more about that in a moment in terms of hair physiology. And that frizziness, that creates a visual blur to the scalp and makes it also more difficult to see. Now let's talk about basic hair physiology in terms of some of the attributes of what makes a hair function on a day-to-day basis and what potentially could predispose it toward fractures or problems. There are several elements to a hair shaft that would lead to potential problems in terms of fracturing, etc. But before we get there, we first have to take a step back and understand the fundamentals of the hair shaft anatomy. So let's, for a moment, forget about the inner root sheath, outer root sheath, all the other components of that make up the hair follicle, but just focus on the hair shaft itself. There are three elements of the hair shaft: the inner medulla, the central cortex, and then the outer cuticle. The medulla is actually not present in vellus hairs, and is variable presence in terminal hairs, the hairs that we're talking about right now, the thick hairs on the scalp of a non-balding scalp. So for all intents and purposes, let's forget about the medulla. Let's focus on the cortex and the cuticle. The cortex makes up the bulk of the hair shaft itself, and that is an element that can be more easily damaged when there's cuticular damage, etc., and that's the component that we really want to focus on. Think of the cuticle as shingles on a roof that line this as one layer around the cortex that provide protection to the cortex. When the cuticle is damaged, that can lead to cortex damage, and that is what leads to fractures and other problems that we're going to talk about more in a moment. So what are the elements that lead to the healthiness of a hair shaft, or what I like to call the hair physiology? The first component is porosity. And most hairs are actually impermeable if they haven't been subjected to various elements such as the sunlight and extreme pH, as well as chemical agents and extreme harsh hairstyling, for example. So the cuticles actually form this impermeable layer, but when there's cuticular damage, then the cortex can be damaged, and that's what leads to fractures and problems we're going to address more in a moment. The second component, besides porosity, is the texture of the hair shaft itself. The texture is composed of a couple things. One is the coarseness or the thickness of the hair shaft itself, and the second thing is the arrangement of the cuticle to the cortex, in terms of, in a wiry hair or thicker hair like an Asian hair, tends to be much wider and straighter. The cuticular adhesion to the cortex can be quite a bit more vigorous and much tighter. Another component is the elasticity, and as we mentioned before, the cortex is probably the most important element of it. Elasticity has a lot to do with the cortex health. A normal cortex that has good elasticity would be able to be stretched about 1 to 1/3 the length and should be able to hold about 100-gram weight. Finally, let's talk about permeability. The permeability is the last factor that really has a lot to do with all three factors in terms of porosity, elasticity, and the texture, but more specifically porosity and texture. It relates to the ability of chemicals to penetrate through the hair, through the cuticle to hit the cortex, and specifically it relates to the porosity, which means the ability of something to go through, and also texture. If the hair tends to be very, very coarse, it's harder for products to go through and penetrate the cortex to create damage. But the porosity actually has a much higher percentage of importance in terms of creating increased permeability and therefore cortex damage. Now, when there's cortical damage, how can it manifest itself? We're not going to go through every particular type of hair shaft defect out there. There's quite a few out there, but we'll hit some of the major highlights. Trichorexis nodosa is the most common of the type of problems that can occur, and basically what this is a nodular swelling in which, with cuticular damage, the cortex can be frayed and actually create breaks in there, and it looks like little nodular swellings. Another type of breaking is called trichoptilosis. Hard to say that, trichoptilosis, and this refers specifically to what we call split ends, which is a longitudinal fracture of the hair shaft at the end. Other types of things that can be caused are such as trichoschisis, which is just a direct break of the hair shaft, and also trichoclasis, which is a green stick fracture where the cuticle stays intact and the cortex breaks inside of it, and so you get this sort of a bended hair, but it's not entirely fractured through. There is trichorexis invaginata, which refers to a type of condition in which there's a ball and socket where actually is just anticipated or telescoped inside the proximal segment of the hair shaft. And the final one we're going to consider is monolithrix, which is a type of hair disease that occurs more commonly in children. And what happens with this disease is that there is actually repeated nodular swellings throughout the hair shaft, and these longitudinal internodal spaces that have these ridges in them, and that can predispose toward breakage. So these are just different patterns of hair shaft defects that can occur when you have problems in the hair physiology. Hopefully this is a good review in terms of hair characteristics and ideas of what we're looking for when we're doing hair transplant, as well as what things could predispose toward weathering of the hair and breakage of the hair.